It was supposed to be just another delivery for me. My name's Jenna. I'm a college student trying to make some extra cash working at a local Chinese restaurant. Saving money for school isn't easy, and every little bit helps. I'm the kind of person who doesn't get scared easily. I like to think of myself as independent and pretty good at solving problems. But nothing could have prepared me for that night. It was late, way past the usual dinner rush, when my boss handed me the last delivery of the night. The address was to a new housing development on the edge of town. You know, one of those places with lots of houses being built, but not many people living there yet. I figured it would be a quick in and out, then I could call it a night. But as I drove closer, I could feel something wasn't right. The streets were super quiet, and the streetlights were few and far between, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out towards my car as I passed. Houses stood half-finished in the moonlight. The whole place felt off, like I'd driven straight into a ghost town. As I drove through the eerie silence of the new development, I started looking for the house number I was given. But the numbers on the houses didn't make any sense. They jumped from one number to a completely different one, completely skipping over the number I needed. Feeling a mix of confusion and a growing knot in my stomach, I decided to call the customer, hoping they could help me out. When the phone finally connected, the voice on the other end caught me off guard. The man sounded rushed and a bit upset, like he'd been waiting forever. His directions were as clear as mud, talking about a turn here and a left there, but nothing he said matched up with what I was seeing. The more he talked, the more my anxiety started to creep up. His tone was desperate, almost frantic. What kind of place was this? After what felt like an endless maze of turns and backtracks, I finally saw it. The house, if you could call it that, was at the very end of a long, neglected road. The only sign that someone might be there was a flickering light shining through one of the unfinished windows. It felt like a scene from a movie, one of those moments where you're screaming at the character to just turn around and leave. But this was real life, and I had a job to finish. There I was, stepping out of my car, standing in front of what might as well have been a haunted house, about to deliver Chinese food to a mystery customer. The moment I stepped up to the door, something straight out of a nightmare happened. Before I could even knock, the door creaked open all by itself, like it was inviting me in. Inside, the house was barely lit, just a single flashlight lying on the floor pointing towards an open basement door. The light flickered, casting shadows across the walls, making the whole scene feel like it was pulled from a horror movie. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave. I thought about calling my boss, telling him something was up. But when I pulled out my phone, my heart sank. No signal, not even one bar. It was like the house was swallowing me up, cutting me off from the rest of the world. Panic started to set in, but I tried to keep my cool. This is just a delivery, I told myself. Just drop off the food and leave. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, but not coming from the house, from outside. I peeked through the doorway, and my breath caught in my throat. Shadows moved in the darkness, figures emerging from the half-built homes that surrounded me. I wasn't alone. And whoever, or whatever, was out there, they weren't just hanging around. They were coming towards me. Every part of me wanted to scream, but I knew I had to be quiet. I had to be smart. I slipped back outside, moving as silently as I could, using the incomplete walls and piles of construction materials as cover. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it. The figures split up, searching with their flashlights, sweeping the beams over the empty lots and half-finished houses. The light came dangerously close to me a few times, but somehow, I managed to stay hidden in the shadows. It was a game of cat and mouse, with me desperately trying to find a way out, but every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the maze of construction. I could hear them calling to each other, their voices low and hunting. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I couldn't let them find me. Finally, I spotted a gap in the fence at the back of the development. It was narrow, but I was slim enough to squeeze through. I made a break for it, heart racing. as I heard shouts behind me. They'd seen me. I pushed through the gap, the rough edges of the fence scraping against my skin, and tumbled out onto the other side. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main road and the comforting glow of street lights. Breathing hard, I looked back towards the development. It was quiet now, the figures gone, as if they'd never been there at all. But I knew what had happened. I knew the danger I'd escaped from. Then, out of nowhere, a voice called out to me. It was a late-night jogger, surprised to see someone else out at this hour, especially someone who looked as scared and battered as I did. He stopped when he saw me, immediately seeing the fear in my eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. I could barely speak, but I managed to tell him I needed to call the police. Without hesitation, he handed me his phone, and I dialed 911, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped the phone. As I spoke to the dispatcher, explaining what had happened, the jogger stayed with me, making sure I was safe until the police arrived. The feeling of relief when I heard the sirens in the distance was indescribable. I was safe. I was going to be okay. The danger was finally over. As the police car pulled up and the officers stepped out, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was out of that nightmare, thanks to my own quick thinking and the kindness of a stranger. It was over, and I had survived. After everything that happened, the police went back to that creepy housing development to check things out. But when they got there, there was no sign of anyone around. No one was found, and it seemed like I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I went through. It was real and terrified me. The police listened to my story, but I could tell they were skeptical. They kept saying things like, "Are you sure?" and "It could have been your imagination." But the scratches from the fence and the sheer panic in my voice were evidence enough that something bad had happened. I will never forget that night I delivered to the wrong address. I realized just how important it is to trust your gut. My instincts told me something was wrong, and they were right. I learned that night that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible. I faced something straight out of a horror movie and came out the other side. I won't lie and say I'm not scared anymore. If anything, I'm more cautious now, but I'm also more confident. I know I can handle tough situations, even when they're scarier than anything I've ever imagined. That night taught me to appreciate life more and not take my safety for granted. I'm grateful for the jogger who helped me and for my own quick thinking that got me out of there. It was a terrifying experience, but in a strange way, it made me who I am today. I'm Emily, and I thought I was safe in my cozy apartment, high up in a nice part of town. This place was full of memories from my job as a food critic. My walls had framed articles of my reviews, the ones that could make a restaurant famous or take away its fame. My kitchen shelves were full of fancy cookbooks, but I wasn't really using them anymore. Ever since I wrote a tough review that shut down Chef Marco's restaurant, things felt different. I started feeling like something bad was going to happen. Maybe it was guilt. I tried to ignore it though. That night, I just wanted to enjoy a simple dinner at home, hoping I could shake the strange feeling. After I ordered my dinner, my phone showed a weird message. "May it linger in your memory." At first, I thought it was a strange joke from the restaurant, but it made me feel nervous, like something wasn't right. Later, while waiting, I felt more uneasy. I convinced myself things were eerily quiet. Then I heard a car outside. The moment I popped my head out the window to look down at the road, the car just sped off really fast. It was super weird and made me even more anxious. I tried to distract myself by thinking about other things, but my mind kept going back to the reviews I'd written. I remembered seeing the faces of the chefs and restaurant owners I had critiqued on the news the day they closed the restaurant. Their eyes seemed full of blame and hate when Marco's partner looked right into the camera and said, "There are heartless people out there who deserve consequences for the suffering they have caused honest, hard-working people." The longer I waited for my food, the more anxious I got. What if Marco was now working at this restaurant? The weird message and my fear of Marco's need for revenge were really messing with my head. I couldn't tell if I was scaring myself or if something was genuinely wrong. It was just supposed to be a quiet night at home, but now I felt like I was waiting for something way more nerve-wracking than just my dinner. When I got my food, there was a scary note inside it. A taste of your own medicine. I knew something was very wrong. I was sure the food was poisoned. Then, out of nowhere, all the lights turned off. I was scared stiff. I heard a loud bang on my front door before it swung open. I knew someone was there to get me, mad about something I said in my work. I grabbed my phone to see in the dark and noticed a figure moving around my living room. My heart was racing. This person seemed to know exactly where to go. This wasn't just random. They were there for me. Feeling my way through my kitchen, I picked up a kitchen knife, trying to protect myself. But the person found me and wrapped their arms around me so hard the knife fell. I moved from side to side with a violence I did not know I possessed. We struggled. I tried to run, but he kept holding on to me. We ended up falling through the front door out into the hallway. I yelled at the top of my lungs, and my neighbor heard me while coming up the stairs. But the attacker pulled me back into my apartment and shut the door, yelling about how I ruined his life. I kicked at him, and for a little bit that helped me move closer to the kitchen again where I could grab another knife. But then he gripped my ankles and I couldn't move. He pulled me closer to him with a rough jerk and started to strangle me. I couldn't breathe, and everything started to blur. Just then, the door flew open. My neighbor had come to help, and at the same time, I could hear police sirens approaching. The attacker ran off, his footsteps echoing down the stairs as he escaped. I was gasping for air, coughing, and trying to calm down. My neighbor stayed with me, making sure I was okay while we waited for the police. We could hear the sirens getting louder, and soon the police were there. They checked the apartment and asked me a lot of questions. I felt so relieved but also really shaken up. It was over, but I kept thinking about how close I had come to something really bad happening. The police said they would do everything to catch the person who did this. My neighbor was kind, staying with me until I felt safe again. I knew I was lucky to be okay and had someone there to help me when I needed it most. After everything calmed down, the days that followed were really tough for me. I kept thinking about that night, the fear I felt, and how close I was to getting seriously hurt. It was hard to sleep, and every little noise made me jump. I was dealing with these heavy feelings, kind of like when someone has a really bad scare that sticks with them, which I learned was something called PTSD. I started to really think about my job as a food critic. My reviews weren't just words. They had the power to change people's lives, sometimes not in good ways. The person who attacked me was someone I had written about, someone who lost a lot because of my review. It made me wonder if I should be more careful with my words, or maybe change the way I write my reviews. The restaurant that had to close because of my review, and the guy who lost his job were all I could think about. I wondered how many others were affected by what I wrote. It was a big wake-up call. I knew I needed to find a way to do my job without causing harm. To be fair and kind, but still honest. I talked to other people in the food world, chefs and restaurant owners, to understand their side better. They shared how tough it can be when a bad review comes out. It made me see things differently and think about how I could help instead of hurt. This whole scary experience changed me. It showed me the real impact of my words and made me want to be more responsible with my power as a critic. I was thankful for the support from my neighbor and the police, and I knew I had to use this second chance to make things right, not just for me but for the people I write about. Starting a new job always gets my nerves going, but this was different. I'm Daniel, fresh out of college and in serious need of cash. So when I landed a gig delivering food for this fancy local place that caters to the rich, I thought I hit the jackpot. My first shift, they tell me I'll be making deliveries to the Sanctuary. Even the name sounded like it was straight out of some mystery novel. It's this isolated spot on the edge of town where all the big shots live, or so I've heard. People say it's not just the money that makes the sanctuary different. It's the residents, kind of wealthy and way out there. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and a tiny bit of dread as I loaded up my car with orders. Delivering to the rich meant good tips, right? But the sanctuary had all these rumors swirling around it, tales of odd parties and stranger guests. I tried to ignore my reservations, reminding myself it's just a delivery. Little did I know, my first night on the job would be one I'd never forget, taking me into the heart of the sanctuary's twisted secrets. The deeper I drove into the sanctuary, the more I felt like I was entering another world. Each house was more extravagant than the last, hidden behind towering gates and lush gardens. It was quiet, too quiet, with only the sound of my car's engine breaking the silence. The kind of quiet that makes you listen a little harder, makes you notice the shadows a little more. The few people I saw were different. They didn't just take their food and nod a thanks like most folks. They lingered, eyeing me with curiosity that felt too intense, asking me questions that no one on a normal delivery run should care about. "How's your health, young man?" one lady asked, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Do you exercise? You look fit," another commented, his smile a little too wide. It was as if they were sizing me up, their words laced with an interest that went beyond casual conversation. Every time I got back into my car, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. But nothing compared to my last stop, the central mansion. It was massive, a huge estate that seemed to swallow up the light. As I rang the bell, the door swung open almost immediately, as if they were waiting just behind it. The man who greeted me was overly enthusiastic. "Ah, you've brought our special order. Please come in. We've been so eagerly anticipating your arrival," he said, ushering me inside with a hand that was a little too firm on my back. The mansion was as lavish inside as it was outside, filled with antiques and art that probably cost more than I'd make in a lifetime. But it wasn't the expensive stuff that unsettled me. It was the atmosphere, charged with anticipation, as if the entire house was holding its breath. And there I was, standing in the middle of it, with a growing sense of dread that this delivery was more than I bargained for. As the man led me through the mansion, the feeling in my gut grew worse. The hallways were too quiet, like we were the only ones there, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. We stopped in front of these giant, carved doors, and he turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your delivery is just in time for our gathering," he said, pushing the doors open. What I saw inside made my heart stop. The room was huge, with a long table set up like something out of a medieval feast. What freaked me out right away was that the guests were all wearing masks, not fancy ball masks, but eerie animalistic ones that looked like they were straight out of a nightmare. And at the head of the table, an empty chair with a mask, just for me. As the man continued to push me towards my seat, I noticed around the room decorations hung that reminded me of old pictures I'd seen in history books, the kind where they talked about sacrifices. That's when I noticed the table was covered in what looked like a map of human anatomy, but made out of meat. It wasn't just any meat, though. It was arranged, too, perfectly, like they were trying to recreate a human body with food. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. "You're the guest of honor," he said, a tone in his voice that made my blood run cold. That's when I realized this wasn't just a weird party. It was something much darker. They didn't want the food I'd brought. They wanted me. I felt pure, cold panic. I turned to run but found my path blocked by two more masked figures. I looked for any way out, my mind racing. How can this be real? Surely they know my company knows where I am. I have heard stories of cannibalism, but honestly never thought it was actually real. Why would these people want to do this? That's when I noticed a small door, partially hidden behind a curtain. It was now or never. I made a break for it, dodging past the figures who reached out to grab me. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. I slammed the door shut behind me and found myself in a dimly lit corridor, my only option to keep moving forward. The corridor twisted and turned, a labyrinth within the mansion. I could hear them still chasing me, their calls to each other a haunting melody of madness. I stumbled into a kitchen, grabbed a heavy frying pan for defense, and kept running. The mansion seemed endless, each room a new terror, but I couldn't stop, couldn't let them catch me. Finally, I saw it, a sliver of light from an open window at the end of a hallway. I sprinted towards it, the voices behind me growing louder, more frenzied. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself through the window, landing hard on the grass outside. My car! I couldn't believe my luck when I saw I exited where I parked my car. I got in and hit the gas as quick as I could, and didn't look back. Breathless and terrified, I didn't stop driving full speed until I saw the lights of a gas station, the normalcy of it so stark against what I just escaped. I was safe for now, but I knew I could never forget the horrors of this awful place. Once I was sure I was not being followed, I left the gas station. When I got back to work, the delivery coordinator met me with a laugh, saying someone from the sanctuary phoned and said they scared me half to death with a prank they played on me. What the hell, I thought. At first, ready to laugh as well. But as I tried to shake the fear but couldn't, I started to think, they are lying. This is just them trying to cover their tracks. I knew there would be no point trying to convince my new colleague of what really happened, or almost happened. So I clocked out for the night and excused myself. That night changed me. I used to be someone who was always looking for adventure, ready to meet new people without a second thought. Now I find myself looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows that seem a bit too dark, and questioning the intentions of strangers. I promised myself I'd never do another delivery job again. The risk just doesn't seem worth it, not after what I went through. The scars from that night aren't just on my skin, they're in my mind too. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that mansion running for my life. It's a constant reminder that sometimes the monsters we hear about in stories are real. They might not live under our beds, but they're out there, hiding in plain sight, wearing the masks of ordinary people. I've learned to be more cautious, to listen to that gut feeling that tells you something's not right. And maybe, just maybe, I've gotten a little stronger too. But I'll never forget my delivery to the sanctuary. It's a stark reminder that the real monsters are the ones that walk among us, masquerading as men,